Father James once believed that money could buy everything: power, security, even peace of mind. But the day he met Diep, that belief quietly began to crumble. She carried no wealth, no influence, yet her sincerity pierced through the walls he had built with success and control. In Diep's presence, he was forced to confront a truth he had long ignored: that some things, love, loyalty, and a family's heart, can never be purchased, only earned.
Father James had spent most of his life believing in a simple, unshakable truth. Money could solve anything. It could silence arguments, straighten crooked paths, and even soften wounded hearts. In the world he built for himself, glass offices, heavy doors, and carefully measured smiles, everything had a price. And because he could afford almost anything, he believed he understood life better than most. To him, love was a transaction disguised as affection. Respect was obedience bought with comfort. Even family, especially family, was something to be controlled. James, his son, had grown up beneath that towering shadow, provided for, educated, protected, yet always distant. Their conversations were short, practical, and heavy with unspoken expectations. Father James called it responsibility. James felt it as a quiet suffocation. Then Diep appeared. She did not arrive dramatically. There was no grand introduction, no calculated entrance into his world. She simply existed, soft-spoken, steady, and unmistakably real. Father James first noticed her not by what she wore or owned, but by what she carried in her eyes, a calm resilience shaped by ordinary struggles. She worked with her hands, cooked simple meals, worried about small things like the weather, a child's homework, tomorrow's expenses, things money rarely had to worry about.
At first, Father James dismissed her. He assumed she was like the others, someone who would eventually be impressed, persuaded, or pushed aside. In his mind, it was only a matter of numbers, a better offer, a quiet arrangement, a clean solution. He had done it before, countless times. Yet something about Diep unsettled him. When he observed her from a distance, he noticed how she laughed without restraint, how she listened without interrupting, how she endured without complaint. She did not ask for anything. She did not perform gratitude. She did not bend. And that, more than open defiance, made him uneasy. In her presence, Father James felt a strange crack form in his certainty. He began to sense that there were corners of life untouched by wealth, places where kindness was currency, where patience outweighed power. Diep belonged to that world, a world he had never needed to understand, until now. As winter crept closer and tensions quietly thickened, Father James stood at the edge of a realization he was not yet ready to accept. For the first time in his life, he faced someone who could not be bought, controlled, or dismissed. And unknowingly, that was where his carefully constructed empire began to tremble. Softly, silently, but inevitably.
If part 1 was the first crack in Father James's certainty, then part 2 was the slow, uncomfortable widening of that fracture. He did not admit it aloud, but Diep had begun to occupy a space in his thoughts where calculations used to live. She was a question he could not answer with numbers. Father James decided to do what he had always done best: test limits. He invited Diep into his world, not with warmth, but with quiet authority, a formal dinner, polite words sharpened by unspoken judgment. The table was long, the dishes expensive, the air heavy with expectation. He watched her carefully, waiting for hesitation, admiration, or fear. But Diep surprised him again. She sat straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap, thanking the staff with genuine smiles. She did not stare at the silverware as if it were treasure, nor did she pretend to belong. She belonged to herself. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but certain, like someone who had learned early that dignity did not come from approval. Father James offered help, subtle at first: better housing, financial support, opportunities wrapped in generosity. To him, these were reasonable gestures, proof of goodwill. To Diep, they felt like invisible chains. She declined without anger, without embarrassment, just a quiet refusal, firm as a closed door.
That refusal echoed louder than any argument.
James, watching from the side, felt something shift inside him. For years, he had believed resistance was useless, that standing against his father only led to exhaustion. Yet Diep stood there, unarmed, unmoved, and somehow unbroken. Her strength was not loud. It did not challenge or accuse. It simply existed. Father James felt irritation rise, followed by confusion. Why wouldn't she accept what others begged for? Why didn't she understand that security came from wealth? The more he pushed, the more clearly he saw it. Diep valued peace over possession, integrity over comfort. That night, long after the house grew silent, Father James sat alone in his study. The city lights outside his window glowed like coins scattered across the dark. For the first time, they felt strangely cold. He realized that all his life, he had confused control with care, provision with love. Diep had not confronted him. She had not raised her voice or demanded respect. She had done something far more dangerous. She had shown him a version of strength untouched by money. And in that quiet revelation, Father James began to understand that some hearts are not meant to be bought, but met.
The conflict did not arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, like a slow winter rain that seeps into walls and weakens foundations from within. Father James, unsettled by Diep's refusal to bend, tightened his grip. Not out of cruelty, he told himself, but out of concern. Concern had always been his most convincing excuse. He began with James. Opportunities were withdrawn. Support became conditional. Conversations turned colder, sharper, filled with reminders of reality and responsibility. Father James spoke of legacy, of reputation, of the dangers of choosing emotion over stability. To him, this was guidance. To James, it felt like punishment for daring to love freely. James grew quieter during those days. The confidence Diep had awakened in him was tested by old fears, the fear of disappointing his father, of losing everything he had built under his name. He carried the weight silently, believing that endurance was the price of being a son. At night, when the world finally slowed, he wondered if love alone was strong enough to survive against blood and power. Diep sensed the change immediately. She noticed it in the way James avoided her eyes, in the pauses between his words, in the tired smile he wore like armor. She did not demand explanations. Instead, she waited, patient as the earth after a storm. When James finally spoke, his voice broke, not loudly, but honestly. He confessed his fear of becoming nothing without his father's approval. Diep listened. Then she took his hand. She did not promise solutions. She did not speak of winning or fighting back. She spoke of choice, of walking forward even when the ground was uncertain, of building a life that belonged to them, not inherited expectations. Her words were simple, but they carried a courage James had never been taught. Meanwhile, Father James watched from a distance, increasingly isolated by his own methods. He saw his son pulling away, not in rebellion, but in quiet resolve. The silence between them grew heavier than any argument. For the first time, Father James felt something unfamiliar: fear. Not fear of loss of power, but fear of losing his son entirely. Late one evening, he overheard laughter drifting from a modest house nearby, Diep's laughter, warm and unguarded. It stirred a memory he had buried long ago, of a time when love had been uncomplicated, when he had not yet learned to trade warmth for control. In that moment, Father James realized the true cost of his authority. Not money, not pride, but distance. And distance, once grown, is far more expensive than he had ever imagined.
The turning point did not arrive with a dramatic confession or a sudden apology. It came quietly, the way dawn slips into the night without asking permission. Father James sat alone in his large, immaculate house, surrounded by things money had bought, silence included. For the first time, that silence frightened him. He had spent his life believing strength meant control,
that love needed structure, pressure, and discipline to survive. Yet the more tightly he held on, the further James drifted away. What unsettled him most was not rebellion, but calm distance. His son no longer argued, he simply lived outside the reach of fear. Diep was the difference. Father James began to notice how people spoke of her, not with admiration for wealth or status, but with gratitude. She helped neighbors without announcing it. She listened without interrupting. She stood beside James without demanding promises or protection. In her presence, James was not smaller, he was lighter. One afternoon, Father James saw them together by chance. Nothing extraordinary was happening. They were sharing a simple meal, laughing softly, caring for a child nearby. It was painfully ordinary, and yet it struck him harder than any confrontation ever could. This was what he had missed. That evening, Father James asked to see James alone. No warnings, no conditions, just a request. When James arrived, prepared for another lecture, he was met instead by an unfamiliar sight. His father, older, quieter, uncertain. Words did not come easily. Pride resisted, but fear lost its power. "I thought money could protect you," Father James finally said. "I thought if you depended on nothing else, you would never fall."
James listened. Diep waited nearby, not intruding, not retreating, present as always. Father James continued, his voice unsteady. "I forgot that when you fall, what you need most is someone who stays." For the first time, he looked at Diep not as a threat, but as an answer he had misunderstood. The reconciliation was not perfect. Years of pain do not vanish in a single conversation. But something shifted. Control loosened. Judgment softened. Father James stepped back, not defeated, but wiser. James did not gain his father's approval through success or obedience. He earned it through honesty. And Diep did not win anything at all. She simply remained true to herself. In the end, Father James learned the lesson he had resisted for so long. Money can build walls, but only love builds bridges. And sometimes, the greatest strength a person can find is the courage to let go.
This story teaches us that true love and family bonds cannot be controlled or bought with money. Father James believed that wealth and authority could protect his son from hardship, but in doing so, he unknowingly pushed James further away. His mistake reflects a reality many people face in everyday life. When fear guides love, it often turns into pressure rather than protection. Through Diep's quiet strength, we learn that genuine care does not need to be loud or forceful. She did not challenge Father James with anger or demand acceptance. Instead, she showed patience, kindness, and consistency. Her presence helped James heal, and through that healing, Father James slowly understood what he had misunderstood for years. The lesson is clear. Love is not about control, sacrifice, or winning arguments. It is about standing beside someone, especially when life becomes uncertain. Parents must learn to trust their children's choices, and children must learn to communicate honestly rather than run away in silence. In the end, the greatest wealth in life is not money, power, or success, but understanding, forgiveness, and the courage to love without fear.